via email instead of in this forum. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Amanda King, who is the SEO specialist at Optus. Amanda, do you want to give us a quick introduction and share your screen?
Sure. Let me share my screen first. Thank you for the kind words. Just give me one moment. Technology is always one of those things that works when you don't need it to and doesn't work when you need it to. So just let's confirm things go soundly.
While you're doing that, actually, Amanda, everyone, I always forget to say this until the person starts speaking, and I was going to do it again. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. Questions. Amanda really wants to answer some tricky questions about technical SEO. So as usual, don't shout out as we go. If you can keep your cameras off, stay on mute, but in the chat, start putting your questions there as we go, and then when we get to the Q&A session at the end, we can ask the questions, and Amanda will answer them for us. So that's the forum for asking and the process for asking the questions. So please get them in the chat box. Over to you.
Sure. And just confirming, Paul, that you can see my screen, that it exists in the internet for you.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I am actually going to save my introduction for last, because you guys came here to hear about enterprise SEO and crawling and indexing, not about me and what I've done. So what we'll go through is what crawling and indexation is, why it matters, what affects website crawling and indexation, some common issues, particularly for enterprise sites and e-commerce websites, how you can find out where your website sits currently and how it's doing, what you can do to improve, and then a little cheeky about me. And apologies in advance, I live on a busy road, so you may hear some unhappy drivers when they're trying to figure out what's going on. Just a heads up on that one. So what is crawling and indexation when we talk about Google and the internet and organic demand? Basically, Google follows links on your website and other websites to see the internet all the time. It's basically like Google's library. But it has a limited attention span because crawling the entire internet is tiring and expensive. Imagine if you had to crawl, if you had to read 1 billion books a day. That's effectively what Google is doing. So Google doesn't always crawl or read your entire website. And even if it doesn't always remember your entire website. So this is the case with massive websites. You can see, Barnes and Noble, which is a bookseller in the United States. Nearly 1/3 of their website isn't indexed. Verizon, so a telco in the United States, the same, nearly 1/3 of their website. Eventbrite, nearly 1/3 of their website. So this is just something to bear in mind when you're thinking about an enterprise level website that has thousands and thousands of pages. You have to be very aware of the pages that are important and what you can do with those pages to really understand and leverage how Google will crawl them and see them and come back to them, because you want Google to come back to your website. So I would imagine many of you have children, perhaps, and been seeing more of them in the last 6 to 8 months than maybe you wanted to. But Google and crawling in particular is like a toddler on a sugar high. If you take away any barriers, it'll keep running around and finding things, and everything will be happy, and you'll be able to get a large portion of your website read and potentially remembered. But if you make it challenging, if you make it difficult and put things in the way, Google gives up. They sit down, have a tantrum, and then who knows? who knows what happens. So we want to really make sure that Google sees everything that it needs to see on our websites. And for a lot of people, they think, oh, Google is great. They can do everything. We don't have to help them. You do have to help them, especially with larger websites. You really need to do everything in your power to make sure that it's as easy as possible for Google to see your website. And that's a part of what we'll be talking about over the next 30 to 40 minutes. And, I haven't gotten this question recently, but I do get this question sometimes. So what? Google only needs to see my website once. Yeah? No. Google crawls your website very frequently, and think of it as a consumer as well. You go to a website and your experience isn't the same between what you're seeing today and what you saw a year ago on that same website. So just as your website evolves and changes, so Google needs to continually come back and try and understand what your website is about. Think about when you release new products, or when you change your product offering, or when you change prices. Google needs to be able to read that. So Google changes the way it understands the content and relevance, especially of your website, all the time. And so sometimes the most important pages of your website may actually be crawled daily. So think about pages like your home page, or your really kind of important category pages, or product pages. So if you constantly and consistently make it difficult for Google to see your website, eventually they may give up. And that could actually have massive ramifications for your business. So Google needs to see your website in order to understand it and serve it in search results when people are searching in Google. Why? Because Google's their mission is to organize the world's information. And the world's information is constantly growing and changing. And they've actually built this into their algorithms in terms of how they understand content throughout the web. So there are two major factors in how frequently or infrequently your website is crawled. How frequently your website is read, and therefore how frequently your website is ranked. So there's popularity. So that is how many people are linking or sharing your website, and then staleness. So how accurate and up-to-date the information on your website is. And remember as well that Google is, in kind of its purest form, it is a library. It can cross-reference your competitors. It can cross-reference your close competitors, or your even kind of completely different product markets, to understand whether or not what you're talking about is still accurate and fresh. So just because it's not something that you can necessarily see or have represented for you, Google does really actually understand whether or not what you're talking about is up to date. They have their own databases of lots of information. So that's an important piece of information to remember. And they've also built those factors into their algorithm and into the way that they rank pages in search. So there are a couple names that I'll throw out here. There are acronyms on here, but I'll explain them for you. So there's QDF, which is Query Deserves Freshness. It was particularly targeted at kind of the moment, more kind of news outlets, but also applies to other industries as well. But basically it was saying, if you publish an article about something that happened on Monday, then you'll probably rank better than someone who published something on Wednesday or Thursday about something that happened on Monday. So they do take into account time relevance. There's also, over the years, they've worked in a number of machine learning algorithms and a number of AI into various algorithm factors. So these days, when Google tells you that they don't know what is going on with individual kind of rankings for searches, a lot of times they're telling the pure truth, because BERT, which was one of the more recent ones, as well as RankBrain, both work in data sets and machine learning that Google can't necessarily control, but that is learning off of how you search. So it's looking for things that a consumer would look for, like, I want the most recent product details, I want the most recent news. So a lot of that gets baked into the algorithm and the way that your page is ranked, and therefore the way that Google reads your page as well. And then there is kind of the old favorite in terms of Google of EAT, or expertise, authority, and trust, which is basically doing everything that you can on your website to persuade Google that you know what you're talking about, that you are an expert in your fields, and that's including relevant information, linking to relevant sources, making sure that you're not misleading customers, making sure that you're including trust signals. So HTTPS, having a strong website experience and a strong customer journey flow. This all wraps into how frequently your website will be read and how frequently it will be remembered by Google effectively. So what else do I need to know? That's a lot of information. What do you actually need to know? There is an ideal website structure for Google. Basically, again, if you're thinking about it like books and chapters, everything that is, say, I'll use telco as an example because that's where I'm working at the moment. So it makes sense to have all your chapters of your book, to have one chapter talking about the same subject, not to have your phones in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, but all of them at the end of the chapter. So sometimes that's how some websites are structured. You want to group everything into kind of the same bucket and the same silo. So for e-commerce websites, sometimes that may mean including any. So if you've got a luxury athleisure wear kind of website, maybe it's including some fitness advice along with your workout gear content, and having that live kind of in the same section of the website. This can be a bit of a challenging space because it kind of goes against the way traditionally we've been doing e-commerce and the way that we structure websites. But when you're looking at it from a reading perspective, that's the way that Google likes to read websites and likes to understand content. Additionally, this is potentially less of a challenge now because so many websites are responsive, but Google now crawls, so reads and remembers and ranks the mobile version of your website. So you want to make sure that any content that you want Google to see and that you want Google to give you presence for is on the mobile version of your website. So you want to make sure that you're designing mobile first. Because if you are taking desktop content and then potentially reducing that content to fit to mobile, that may be hindering your visibility and hindering the way that Google reads and remembers your website, because they are reading and remembering the mobile version, which may have less content than your desktop version if you originally designed your website that way. Additionally, a lot of websites these days are moving towards JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks. Now that's great because it gives you a lot more interactive functionality and kind of interactive elements of your website. But one thing that you do need to keep in mind is that this adds a roadblock for Google. This adds one more step that Google has to go through to really truly understand what's going on your website. It actually requires Google to crawl your page twice. And what happens is the first time Google will read and index the HTML, which is what most kind of static websites, so most kind of brochure sites are built in. And then it will have to come back, put it in a queue and read it again in order to actually be able to understand the JavaScript. And that takes time, and it does also actively cost Google more money. So they are actually a bit kind of staggered and a bit aware about that. Usually, sometimes it's for smaller e-commerce websites, sometimes it's taken up to a month, even longer for JavaScript pages to get read and indexed. So that's something, if you know you have a JavaScript website, or if you know you may be looking to implement JavaScript on your pages, that would be something to talk to your developers about. So in terms of common problems, look, there are a lot of factors for enterprise websites. It's often one of those things, especially at larger enterprise websites like Optus, where you come from a lot of fractured data sources and a lot of fractured platforms, and that's where things like what I was talking about with the JavaScript, that can come into play, because sometimes that JavaScript or that particular framework or that particular method of implementation on your website is only for a fraction. It's only for a small piece, but that can have kind of a snowball effect if it continues. One of the largest considerations for e-commerce websites in particular is faceted navigation. Now, that would effectively be if you can filter and that filter automatically creates pages. So someone wanted a blue gaming laptop under $1,000, and that created its own category page or its own product level page, blue gaming laptop 1,000, something like that. That is actually a very common feature of a lot of e-commerce platforms. I know generally Shopify tries to actively work against that. But there are some other larger enterprise level platforms that will still do that faceted navigation if that's not something that you manage. Now, the kind of epitome of that is the little black dress at Macy's. There are, at the time of this screenshot, there was 12,300 results just for category level pages, so faceted navigation for black dresses. And looking at it now, you can see there are about, I can't do math, there are a few hundred more. And this is something where obviously you have to ask yourself, are all of these 12,000 odd plus category pages useful either to the customer or to Google? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is probably going to be no. So obviously, the ideal solution here would be to talk to your development team and your engineers when you were building this e-commerce structure and not do it that way. But there are ways to mitigate it and help reduce the impact of this kind of faceted navigation. Now, the easiest, the kind of approach that you would want to take is looking at it from a revenue and profit perspective first off, and seeing, taking a look at kind of all of the category pages that you have, and really trying to understand what I just said, whether or not all of these are relevant, all of them are profitable, and whether or not it's actually helpful. And if there is actual search volume for blue gaming laptop under $1,000 or little black dress under $100. And if you're able to answer yes to all of those questions, then that category page is probably worth keeping and probably worth optimizing. But if those faceted category pages don't answer those questions, so if there isn't enough search volume, if there's not enough profit margin, and if it's not actually helpful to a good chunk of your customers, then it's actually worth looking into removing these from the index. Now, the best way to do this is a method called the robots.txt file. It's basically a master file within your website that tells Google explicitly what to pay attention to, so what to read and what not to read. And if you're able to manage it there, then that's the ideal. There are other on-page signals that you can send to Google, but generally those are a less effective method. And if anyone would like to know the details of that, if it's something that you're actively kind of working through at the moment, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I don't want to get too technical in this session. I love the technical elements of SEO. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't. But it can get a bit boring and it can get a bit dry. So let's keep moving through. But if anyone wanted to ask about the details after we wrap up this presentation, feel free to ask, and I'd be happy to provide further detail. But beyond faceted navigation, sorry, let's just, so one of the other things, again, especially with enterprise level sites, is you want to keep pages out of the index that your customers don't need to be seeing. So they don't need to be seeing thank you pages, they don't need to be seeing confirmation pages, and they don't need to be seeing internal site search results. And internal site search results can really bog down your readability, the accessibility of your website to Google. Because imagine if Google, as well as kind of reading the 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 50,000 pages that are on your website, just as a customer, imagine if they had to sit down and go through every single random search that someone made on your website, like black ladies pumps or high heels for a wedding, or they had to sit down and go through all of those individual searches as well. It's a waste of time. It's useless, and it can really impact how Google is able to see and understand your website. And the biggest thing with both faceted navigation and just generally managing what Google reads is coming back to what I mentioned earlier. Google is like a toddler on a sugar high. Like, everyone kind of expects Google to know what they're on about and be able to kind of understand their website at first glance. But it's a machine, it's a robot. It is only as good as the information that you give it. So if it somehow starts going down a path from your homepage to your search results and doesn't go to any of your product pages, you can't control that. You're kind of out of luck at that point, because Google has decided to go down this direction because you haven't told it not to. So a lot of enterprise SEO is about managing what Google sees and actively managing what Google sees. Because just as there is kind of the CX principle of, don't make me think, the same kind of principle applies to Google. you don't want to make it have to think. You don't want to make it have to try and understand a new situation or a situation that it isn't prepared for. You want to make it as clear as possible which direction you want Google to go. And again, sometimes we will tell Google conflicting information just in some of the on-page directives that we give it. Again, this is a relatively technical implementation, but I included it here so that if, you know, at some point in your conversations with your developers or your engineers, you heard them talking about an xrobots tag or a meta robots tag or a canonicalization, that pings a light bulb off for you and you're like, I heard about this. This could be an issue. Let's investigate that further. So this is really something to help trigger your memories so that you understand that this can be a trigger issue in terms of we may be sending conflicting information, and that can lead to issues with the way that Google reads and remembers and understands your website. And this is a fun one that has only really happened recently in recent kind of algorithm updates. Sometimes Google will just skip parts of your website that it feels like aren't immediately relevant to what's going on. So if, say, on your product page, you had similar products or related topics, Google knows what that is and recognizes that it's not a primary relationship to whatever that product may be. So sometimes if it's particularly tired or particularly cranky, it may just skip them altogether. So some of it is of Google's own making. And this is kind of what you need to be aware of as well, is sometimes Google is just kind of like, nah, I'm done. It's not going to happen today. I'm going to go to bed. I need a nap. So sometimes it's just Google. It's just what happens. And this will happen probably more and more as Google integrates more machine learning and more AI into the way that they read and understand pages, and the way that they read and understand the internet. So how do I know how my website is doing? How do I know? So there is a tool called Google Search Console, though I unfortunately didn't update these slides. They changed the name like 2 days ago to Google Search Center, I believe, question mark. But this will actually tell you generally at a high level what Google is reading, and it will give you a strong idea of what Google isn't reading, what it's seeing, what it's understanding in what's called a coverage report. And then you can also be a little manual and do exactly what I did here. And so do a site search in Google, and you'll be able to see what's going on. So you've got Macy's with 3.7 million results. And then you can literally just page through. Or if you want to particularly see a particular page, you can do oh no, I actually forgot a part of our site structure, but you can actually search directly for a URL, and it will tell you what Google is seeing specifically for that page. So if you have a page on your website that you feel like Google isn't seeing, you can do this direct kind of site search into Google and get immediate feedback as to whether or not you are getting those results. You can also put in a particular line of copy, and it will tell you whether or not that copy is coming up. So those are all kind of ways to troubleshoot and see what is and is not being read and seen by Google, so that you can understand whether or not that particular page or that particular category that may be important to your business is or isn't in Google, if it's a part of that 30% that they aren't seeing, or if they are in fact seeing it, and maybe you just need to do a bit of work to optimize that page. And generally, you should see similar numbers between what Google is seeing in a site search and what Google is seeing in Google Search Console. If those are particularly different, then something may be up in the way that your website is built, or in the way that things are kind of working. And so what can I do to improve it? Like, what is that? Generally, kind of the big three when it comes to indexation in particular. Well, sitemap is a bit of a little third, but really kind of looking at your site architecture and seeing if it's something that is actually reflective of the way that your business is working, what people think is popular, what people are coming to. And like I was talking about earlier, whether or not you're kind of siloing your products in ways that Google is able to easily read and understand. And then what we mentioned around JavaScript and responsive design is a big one. And I know for a lot of websites these days, it is kind of the new shiny thing, especially if in the last couple of years you've done a website redesign. It's very likely that website redesign was based on a JavaScript library. Now, it is not something you would make any friends by going into your engineering team or your front-end development team and saying, hey, we need to completely rebuild our website because it's based on JavaScript. I know sometimes I would like to do that with my team, but would not win me any favors, and it would take a long time. So in terms of interim solutions for this, a lot of times what front-end developers or engineers can do is what's called dynamic rendering or server-side rendering. So dynamic rendering is basically where people who come to your website will still get the kind of JavaScript interactions and all of that kind of fun and cool interactivity. But you will actually show Google and search engines a static HTML version of your website. And then there's server-side rendering, which is typically where both users and so server-side rendering is where you will still get the interactivity of the JavaScript in the browser. No worries, that's always still going to be there, but all of your code, so including your JavaScript, all of that is actually rendered in HTML. So the browser isn't doing the heavy work of trying to read and understand the JavaScript. And then that usually will help mitigate, and oftentimes doing server-side rendering or dynamic rendering will also improve your page performance, which, as we know, is a core web vital and is something that Google is integrating into their ranking signals as of March 2021, but is done in other ways, kind of sideways now. And then at a kind of last recommendation is making sure that your sitemap is up to date. I know, especially with enterprise level websites, it can get very unwieldy. And I'm right now, I am definitely one of those people that is do as I say and not as I do, because Optus, if you look at our sitemap, it is horrendous. It definitely could be better managed, but ideally you want to, again, you don't want to make Google think. You only want to show it in the sitemap, the pages that you have that are live. So that means going through and making sure that there are no dead pages, so that there are no 404 pages, that there are no pages that get redirected, that there are no pages that have canonicals that go to different pages, that there are no pages that have a meta no index tag, and really, really making sure that the sitemap is clean and sparse and spruce. And before I tell you a little bit about me and what my history and what I've done, just a bit of a final word on enterprise and what I found to be the major challenges. I would say the biggest consideration for me is actually it's relationships, right? Because enterprise level, there are a lot of teams, there are a lot of people. It's really about getting on the good side of your sales team and your engineering team and your front-end developers. They all may be in different buildings and they all may have different agendas and different goals. So it's really about getting to know different people and understanding how to speak their language, and understanding what's important to them, as well as understanding how, say, things like that all of the kind of faceted navigation, how that affects sales, and what that means. So that's why looking at things like the revenue of that random category page that gets 3 visitors, the impact of that. If it's only getting $2 in revenue in the last year, why do we need it? You get what you want, and they get a feel good story as well. So it's always kind of about those conversations and about that give and take, and about technology adoption as well. Things tend to take time, even though digital moves very quickly. So it's about understanding that pace, and to a certain extent coming to terms with that pace as well. Because in a digital world, sometimes we want things to move very quickly, but oftentimes at enterprise, you've got to be planning these projects out 6 months, a year in advance, or acknowledging that when you put them in the pipeline, they will probably take 6 months to a year. And just a little bit about me. I've been in marketing and SEO for 10 years. I've spent about 8 years in analytics. I've got about 5 years in conversion rate optimization, A/B testing, and UX. I've lived in 3 countries and visited about 40. This photo is actually of me in Mongolia, in the little Gobi Desert. And if you can't tell, or if you're curious, I grew up in the United States. So my accent is the East Coast in the US. But sounds like we've got a couple of questions. I've been seeing the little flashy bob.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. That was really cool.
No worries.
I'm really glad you got that last comment in at the end, because I think one of the conversations that we have around enterprise SEO, or enterprise anything actually with digital, is the human elements. So everyone runs straight to the tech, but I think from our experience dealing with enterprise business, the human side of it and the political side of it is an enormous task that you have to get.
It's not politics, it's conversations.
Yeah. That's the word I was looking for. Awesome. So I'm going to jump to a few questions. So Nishant, thank you very much for jumping in. You were really early there. So Nishant wants to ask, how do you manage offsite SEO activities like link building for such a large website like Optus?
Well, I'm going to be that annoying human being that says, I don't. Optus is very lucky in that we get a lot of natural press. And again, actually, this kind of plays back into the relationships as well, because oftentimes for enterprise companies, working with influencers, doing link building, actually can be a large liability. So sometimes there has to be a lot of legal overhead, oftentimes. So I know some of my colleagues have worked to do link building in the past, or larger link building projects, say like working with influencers or doing campaigns. And I've run into roadblocks because of the liability there. I know some of the things that we have been successful with in the past have been effectively broken link building. So going and finding references to Optus where we aren't linked to, and reaching out to the webmasters or to the press and saying, hey, just noticed you guys have mentioned us but didn't link back. Can you share a link to X? Oftentimes as well, I know one of my colleagues did that specifically around our logo. So that's doing specifically kind of image-based link building. So those are two that I know are feasible for us. But overarchingly, not even necessarily that we don't, but kind of that we can't because of the liabilities there.
Okay, so just a quick question on that. Actually, is that done by the SEO team within your organization? Who actually is? So, if you take a scenario like the finding unlinked mentions and going after those, is that done by a PR? By your PR or by the SEO team? Who looks after that?
So that was actually us. That was an initiative that we did.
Right. Okay.
Mm.
It's not
that
like
was
an ongoing team effort. That's.
No, it was one of those things that actually started before I joined and had run out of steam before I had joined as well. So it was an archival project.
Okay, cool. I'll ask other people's questions first, Freddie. Freddie's just dropping a ton of questions, so I think you may have to be selective about your questions. But Miroslav is asking, what tools do you use or recommend for crawling large websites, many millions of URLs, and then for working with large data sets it produces?
Sure. So one of my all-time favorites that I will always recommend, that is one of the least expensive tools out there, is Screaming Frog. It's massive and it has so much functionality. If you have a JavaScript heavy website, it can run into trouble. And if you have a smaller amount of RAM on your computer, it can run into trouble. But because Screaming Frog is downloaded, it is as powerful as your computer is. So if you have a large enterprise level website and you have Screaming Frog, I would suggest doing it on a powerful desktop. And you can actually do Google searches around how to increase the RAM that Screaming Frog uses. And the guys at Screaming Frog are all sweethearts as well. So you can just reach out to them and ask like, hey, I have like 1 million pages, help me, and they will. If that isn't something that works for you for whatever reason, there's also tools like Sitebulb, which can do the same thing and is also downloaded to your machine. And then there's also Botify, which works a little bit differently and is a bit more focused on your rankings as well.
Awesome. That's a really, really in-depth answer. Thank you very much. Cool. Freddie, I don't even know where to begin with your question, so I'm just going to hand straight over to you. Yeah, I'm going to go on mute. You help yourself.
Okay. Amanda, I'm so sorry. I know I was mailing you awesome talk.
No, don't worry about it.
Basically, the whole time I was just like, I need to ask her. I need to ask Amanda this. I need to ask Amanda that. I suppose you brought on points that I think is so evident across SEO at enterprise level about relationships, and I think that's probably we can talk all night about technical, but really that's often the one that where we get stuck. I'll ask my first questions around getting buy-in from management. I think this is something that any SEO that has worked with, whether in-house or agencies, have had issues with. Certainly I have. How do you get buy-in from management, and especially I'd say we heavily dependent on large scale and enterprise with devs. How do you get your tickets pushed into production? Because you can rack up 80 or 100 tickets in Jira and then nothing gets moved. What's your any tips and tricks?
Yeah, so I mean, I am one of those kind of oddball SEOs that started out in content writing and SEO, but then I got pulled into the world of technical SEO. I got pulled into the world of analytics and UX and CRO. So I'm very T-shaped in that sense, in part because I've tried having these conversations without kind of having that background, and it's been challenging. So it kind of comes down to what I was saying earlier for me, where I figure out how to speak their language, and I figure out what's important for them at enterprise and at Optus. So I'm sure every company, you've got your mission, your vision, your 4 kind of key strategic pillars, whatever those may be. And oftentimes, one of those key pillars is customer experience, right? And at least for online, a massive part of customer experience is page performance, and that's known. So I would say that is probably one of my secret tools. A bit of my secret sauce is if I can, I try and find a way to link whatever SEO initiative that I'm doing back to improvements to the page performance, specifically site speed. Oftentimes, whether it's minifying the CSS, consolidating the JavaScript, doing server-side rendering or dynamic rendering, stuff that can have actually a really big impact on the crawl and indexation, and what Google sees of your website. If I can tie it back to something that isn't SEO, oftentimes that will help get buy-in, because it's about the performance, or it's about accessibility. Accessibility is actually a big one, because there's litigation actively around websites that aren't accessible. So it is something where you could get your legal team on your side if you're like, hey, this isn't accessible. We need alt attributes. We can't have our kind of main header be a full image because it's critical information and people can't read it. And look, it's all legitimate and it's all true, but you also have a secondary ask behind it as well, because it will help you as well.
I love it. I absolutely love it. This is amazing, because I've had fights with mostly UX teams talking about Google as a and sorry if I'm not being correct here. I don't mean in the wrong ways. As a special need user, in the sense that they don't see pretty pictures, they don't see JavaScript. It's a user with a different almost browsing experience. But now you brought in the big guns. You say we may not be compliant for the for US ADA, American Disability Act, or for the Australian disability standard framework and things like that. Bring legal, suddenly everything, just the world changed. Actually, while we're talking about legal, they are also a big part of the entertainment for any regulated industry. What you talked about relationships. How do you work relationship with legal? Because they generally are a challenge. I'm not saying a blocker, a challenge for any marketers or SEO. How do you deal with them? If you can share something.
Yeah, no, look, I'll speak a bit broadly, obviously, because I can't get too specific because litigation. But look, you learn very quickly what legal is conservative about and what legal flags. And generally, I will anticipate that and give them the answer to their question. So if it's something where we're putting some FAQs on our pages to try and get an answer box answer. And it's something that needs to be sourced to say, look, it's some claim that somebody made somewhere. I'll make sure that there is a source for that claim, because I want this to get published as much as legal wants to approve it. And so it's a matter of making it easy for them by anticipating what their concerns are going to be, and treating people like human people. Like it's simple, but
Not
it
like
gets forgotten sometimes.
Yes. No, thank you so much. I have one last, and Paul, you can mute me if I speak too much or ask too many questions.
No worries.
He knows he let the cat out of the box with me talking with you directly. I've got one last question in regards to, let's say, enterprise issue and management. You mentioned the importance of managing relationship. I suppose from your perspective, what percentage of your time, how much time do you spend per week building and maintaining and building those relationships internally? How big of a task it is, effectively?
Pre-COVID or post-COVID? It's definitely a bit more difficult when working from home. But like I would say most of my chats are like Teams kind of chats or like Skype kind of chats. Most of that is relationship building, and maybe there's an ask in there 1 out of 5 times. I would say more at, that's a hard question. I don't know, but it's just generally, I try to approach people that I know I have asks of more frequently than I ask things of them. So if it's something where I'm making an ask to a person, once a day or something, they'll be on my regular chat list. If it's something where, I'm asking someone something, I don't know, once a week or once a fortnight, catch up with them every once in a while and see how things are going. And it's building relationships over time, right? So at the beginning of, if a new lawyer comes in, you'll work with them a bit more closely for a while. Or if a new front-end dev or if a new engineer comes in, you'll just be like, hey, I like you. Let me bribe you with coffee and cookies and yeah.
My type of methods, beer and pizzas for the devs.
For sure.
But you're far more fancy with cookies and coffee. Awesome. Again, this is my last question. Promise. Edwin, this is coming for you. And sorry, I stopped. I love your analogy of the toddler in a sugar high going everywhere around the site. Now, this is something that we worked on, so excuse if it's a bit self-serving, but how do you manage that toddler on sugar high to do what you want? Or in more technical terms, do you work, how do you work on pruning the site and potentially optimizing the internal linking structure when you are on an enterprise level? Do you let it run and hope for the best? How do you manage that effectively?
Yeah, no, look, personally, in part because of the way that our organization is structured, we're in Agile, so we're in squads. But I would still probably tackle it this way anyway, is I would proof of concept it. I would either go for your highest volume or one of your lower volume products or product groups and focus in on that and really look at, the internal linking structure, really look at how it's organized, and use it as a bit of a trial and see how things respond. And you can use that as justification as well. Once you get evidence that, oh, hey, like adding in I'm going to use an example that I said Google doesn't always read, but putting in like a related articles or a related products module, if you just did that and said, doing that has caused our organic demand to increase by 20%, like you can use that as a stepping stone to say, okay, we need to get a bigger project behind this and understand the kind of full scope of it, because you know, you're trying to kind of eat the elephant if you take it all on at once, and you could, you know, completely fall on your ass and fail. Sorry.
Awesome.
Sorry, Paul, were there any other questions in the chat? I've been seeing it flash a little bit.
Yeah, Edwin is rushed off, so I'm not going to do Edwin's question, but Nishant had one more question, which was how, and this is the last one because we're past 9 o'clock. So how do you benchmark or track yourself against competitors?
Third-party tools.
Is there anything that you're using, or?
So currently we are using Conductor, but there are some other really good tools as well. So there's oh my god, why can I not remember any names? SEO Clarity is particularly good. You can also use tools like Ahrefs or SEMrush as well to really even just get a top level sense of how you're ranking against competitors for individual keywords, or also how you're ranking at kind of an overarching like presence level or a share of market level as well.
Okay, cool, very good. Freddie, there was one question I wish you had asked around internal linking, because it's something that we're all very interested in here. However, I think we will keep that for another time, because I can see people disappearing already. So Amanda, thank you so much for your time today. That was a super interesting talk. Cool. And always, I think some additional depth comes out in the questions. So I really enjoyed the Q&A session. We're getting lots of praise and thank you from everyone here. So thank you for doing this talk for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming. And Freddie, we can get some coffee sometime.
Excellent.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Love to.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm going to call this to a close now, and hopefully see you at the next one.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.